Welcome to Nurturing Our Roots. This is your host, Antoinette Harrell. Our history, our stories, our legacies is full of rich history to explore and to share. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I am very excited to have my dear friend and colleague, author Bernice Alexander Bennett, who have done so much great work. But tonight, she's going to be talking about the book, The Black Homesteaders. And tonight, we'll be joined by three guests who have done extensive research on their ancestors who was also homesteaders. I would like to welcome my dear friend and colleague, who I'm so proud of. This woman is just there's no words to express the hard work, the dedication that Bernice has committed her life to doing this life work. So without saying that, let me welcome Bernice to the show tonight as we talk about some of these fascinating stories that will be coming out of Florida. Welcome, Bernice. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you for inviting us to share our stories, and specifically the stories of the Florida homesteaders. For those of you who don't even know what we're talking about land that was acquired under an act called the Homestead Act of 1862. Individuals could get up to 160 acres of land. And what's exciting about this is we have contributed, all of us, to a book called The Black Homesteaders of the South. And one part of that South we're talking about is Florida. And so joining us tonight are three contributors to this book. The first is Falan Goff, and Fallon is a family historian and genealogist, and she also has a career in the agriculture field. We also have a recording artist, Orice Jenkins. Orice is also an educator, and he is a historian and and genealogist.
Welcome.
And finally, we have Margo Lee Williams. Now, Margo is an award winning author, family historian, and genealogist. And so they have all contributed to this book, the first of its kind, The Black Homesteaders of the South.
Wow. Let me just commend each of you because it's a labor of love. It's needed. You're honoring your ancestors, you're honoring yourself, and you're honoring the future. So thank you for the legacy and honoring those legacies. Thank you. So tonight, Bernice, who will be presenting first?
Fallon is going to present first.
Good evening, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll go ahead and pull up my presentation.
Okay, let me bring it to. Okay, there it is.
There, yes, it took a little while to upload, but thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here amongst you all, and a pleasure to speak about my Black homesteader. So again, my name is Falan Goff, and as Bernice mentioned, my specialty is agriculture and genealogy. I have a focus area for over 20 years in Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida, and more recently, the Black Homesteaders. And if you'd like to find any of my research, it's published in the Black Homesteaders of the South book and also on the National Park website. I wanted to start with this quote. In every conceivable manner, the family is a link to our past, bridge to our future, by Alex Haley. And that's the attitude and mindset I use when researching. And again, my background is genealogy and agriculture. And I speak about that so much because the Black homesteaders were part of the foundation of agriculture in America. So I never thought that those two hobbies or careers of mine would cross paths until I decided to research my homesteader. With that being said, I'll speak about the homesteader, or the first homesteader I found, which was my third great uncle, Simon Bell, otherwise known as Sim Bell. He was a Black homesteader from Gadsden County, Florida, more specifically, an area in Gadsden County called Chattahoochee, Florida. So Simon was born in 1842, and if you pay attention to the dates, that was pre-emancipation. Uh, Post-emancipation, he married his wife, Eliza Kilcrease, and then at 37 years old in 1872, he filed for his homestead application. And Simon filed for his homestead application at the county clerk's office in Tallahassee. So that was about it's about a 40-mile drive. I don't know what method of transportation they used back then, but it is about 40 miles away from his homestead. And he applied for 39.94 acres, and he only paid $7 for the application filing fee. So all this information was given to me by Bernice when she was able to retrieve my Black homesteaders homestead application from the National Archives. What we found were some interesting revelations about Simon. So here pictured is that application, a portion of it. And in the application, you'll receive an interview, kind of like a testimony, and sometimes it's like a witness statement. So interesting finds that we picked up in his application was that when asked, was he a native born citizen of the United States? Simon wrote, I am a native born citizen of the United States by virtue of the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln. So, in that statement, he revealed to me and to everyone else that he was born into slavery and was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And just knowing that little piece of information actually gave or enlightened me on my family search to discover our own history, because at the time that wasn't in any documentation.
Oh, amazing.
So yes, and so there are some more interesting facts. I tell everybody, when you're searching for your homesteader, you may uncover things or open doors that you thought may have been closed, but it may provide you with information. As mentioned, I found out he was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Another point of interest was Simon cultivated corn, cotton, sugarcane, potatoes, ground peas, and rice. So, in this one witness statement, I found what was grown during the time in that area. And as a person who specializes in agriculture for 20 years, that's something I found very interesting. I knew exactly what my family was growing, what crops they grew, and how it relates to who I help today in terms of farmers and the crops that they grow. I also found out Simon had 9 children, and working with his application led me to want to dig some more. I followed the breadcrumbs. So I began to search on ancestry.com and family search, and I pulled up the 1900 census. And in that census, I was able to find Simon Bell. But what was more interesting, and what I had never known, what my family had not passed down to me, what I had not found in my own research, was that my um, great grandmother lived with Simon on the homestead. So here pictured is Louisa Scott, and she's at the bottom of this picture, and her daughter, Maud Lee. And then over on the next page was my great grandmother, Simon's grandniece, Olivia. So, in one application, our homestead application, and from finding one of my Black homesteaders, I found out about him being enslaved. I found out that my family actually lived together. And this helped me piece together some of our cultural traditions. I don't know if many of you in your own cultural traditions have kind of a community oriented family where multi generations may live together. Nieces and nephews visit grandparents over the summer. In this case, this was a reflection of what we do today. My great grandmother and her mother visited Simon over the summer and stayed there. And that's what this census told me. And so I'd like to share with everybody that if you decide to search for your ancestor or your relative as a Black homesteader, also decide you can choose to discover and branch out and find more information about them. You can follow the breadcrumbs. You can discuss. You can follow the breadcrumbs, and they can lead you into different places. And that also led me to do a little bit more research. I discovered over 150 other Black homesteaders from Florida. And I've also connected some of those Black homesteaders to their living descendants and shared their homestead story with them. And that's all because I decided to one day discover my own homesteader. And another thing that I was able to do was I found the land that once belonged to Simon Bell. I have gone to college and lived outside of the land that belonged to him and never knew that this was once in my family. So here pictured is Simon's land in Chattahoochee. Once I found out that he was a Black homesteader there, I looked up the coordinates and we actually went there and visited. This is a picture of my family holding the soil from the land. I wrapped it in a bell to symbolize Simon. So, this research has opened up new doors for me and my family. And I just like to close out with a quote. In all of us, there is a hunger, marrow deep, to know our heritage, to know who we are and where we have come from. And without this enriching knowledge, there's a hollow yearning. No matter what our attainments in life, there is still a vacuum, an emptiness, and a most disquieting loneliness. And this is by Alex Haley. So if you're ever wondering if you should go out there and see if you have a Black homesteader, I encourage you to do so. And I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity and to have met Bernice and everyone on this panel. So thank you for your time tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm going to hold them at to the end. Wonderful research and just so much, to honor your ancestors and the accomplishments that they made, especially learning that he himself said, I was held enslaved.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The next person is going to be Horace. Let's go ahead and get his. Can you pull it up? Horace, can you pull up your presentation?
Yes, it should be there.
All right, let me just go down a little bit. See if I can pull it up for you. If we can have Fallon to remove hers, and then we can. Let's see. No, that's Margot's. Am I correct?
That's Margot's.
Okay, yeah. Let me just remove that one. Okay, there you go.
There's me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you again for having us on here. This is really wonderful. I'm excited to talk about Florida, one of my favorite places to be. A beautiful, beautiful land there. So we're going to talk about Stephen McCaskill, who was a Florida homesteader and also the ancestor of many legendary musicians and a relative of mine. So we're very proud of him. We're going to talk a little bit about his early life. He was born in Jackson County, Florida, um, possibly biracial, uh, son of John Jett McCaskill and a formerly enslaved woman named Annie Hogan. And he actually lived with Mr. McCaskill in the 1870 and 1880 censuses. And you see the census right here from 1880. He's the only Black person in this house, with all these white people with the same last name as him. Um, we'll need some DNA evidence possibly that can confirm that, but it's believed that he is the son of John McCaskill. He married Emma Houston on October 25th, 1891, and they settled on their land just a year later, November of 1892. And 2 years later, he made his application for the homestead, November 19th, 1894. He could sign his own name, which you see to the right. That is his signature. So whenever I see an ancestor signature, I get really excited and always want to share that, this is what they wrote. And his signature is all throughout the land entry papers. So he was pretty good at signing his name. But he actually had to reapply for the homestead in March of 1895 because he put the wrong land entry numbers on his application. Someone told him the wrong number, so he had to reapply a few months later. And thankfully, that went through okay. So 5 years after that, he was able to come back and make his final proof that he had built something on the land, done something with it, and then he was able to get his final patent on April 9th, 1901 for 160 acres and 37 hundredths of an acre, of beautiful land in the area of Freeport, Florida. I think I have a little bit of a map here. Yes, so you can see the town of Freeport is up here in the top, and Stevens Land is not too far away right here. And you can actually see the Gulf of Mexico a little bit over here. So this is all in the panhandle of Florida, and that's Stevens Land. Yeah, that big chunk of land right there. So on the 1910 census, he is there. He is recorded as a homeowner. But he's widowed at this point. Emma Houston is not there, but he has children there named Nathan, George, Edward, Delia, and his mother is living with him at this time, Annie. So I'm going to talk about one of his children really quick, Delia. Delia later went on to marry Nicholas Drinkard. And he was from Early County, Georgia. So they left and moved to Georgia, and then they moved to Newark, New Jersey, where Delia gave birth to Cissy Houston, one of the most legendary voices of all time. Sang background on countless records by Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley, and you name it. Well, Stephen McCaskill, a homesteader, that's her grandfather. And this is the marriage license of Nick Drinkard and Delia McCaskill. Here's a photo of Delia Mae McCaskill Drinkard. This comes from Cissy Houston's book, How Sweet the Sound. I think it's a really beautiful photo. Delia died very young, so I'm glad that they have a photo of her. But thinking about when she was likely born on Stevens' homestead, because she was born around 1903. And also, she married into another land-owning family. The Drinkards owned land themselves in Early County, Georgia. Not homestead land, but still, I think it's powerful that you think about two land-owning families uniting like that. And there's a lot of great things that can come from that. And of course, with Delia being Cissy Houston's mother, that means she's Whitney Houston's grandmother. And she's also Dionne Warwick's grandmother, and also Dionne's sister, who was also a great singer, Dee Dee Warwick. Well, Dee Dee Warwick's real name was Delia. So Dee Dee was actually named after Delia McCaskill. So as I was researching the Drinkards, and that's how I'm related to the McCaskills, by the way, through the Drinkards, I was looking into them living in Newark, and I noticed another Drinkard that was living next to them, and it said James Drinkard. And I was like, oh, that's Uncle Jim. I know that, I know who that is. And I said, well, I don't remember him being married to an Emma though. So I said, let me look and see who this Emma is. And I realized they got married in New York City. And New York City released all their public records last year up to 1950, which has been great for me because that's where a lot of my family is from. And I got this license, and it said that Jim Drinkard was married to Emma McSkell, and that her parents' names were Oliver and Rachel Houston. And I realized, well, Emma McCaskill, who was married to Stephen McCaskill, her parents' names were Oliver and Rachel Houston. So when Stephen said on the 1910 census that he was widowed, that was not true, because here is Emma, who was married to him, getting married in New York City in 1926. So he was not widowed, but I guess they split up, and she ended up moving to Newark and actually marrying the uncle of Niche Drinkard. Um, so Emma is right here up north the whole time. And I actually, in Sissy's book, she talks about growing up next to her grandmother.
Oh.
Um, and she's actually named after her grandmother. Sissy Houston's real name is Emily. So that's comes from Emma. Back in Florida, Stephen McCaskill remarried to a woman named Millie Lacey Campbell, who was from Coffee County, Alabama, which is another important place for my genealogy because I have other homesteaders from there.
Mm-hmm.
And but they got married in 1920, and they're on the 1930 census together. Stephen is the owner of a home worth $200, which is a pretty good mid-sized range. If you look at the range of the other homes on the page, they range from 50 to 500. So he's right there in the middle with 200. And also, Millie ended up dying a few years later from a stroke in 1936. So that time he truly was widowed. And then he lived the rest of his life actually with his nephew staying with him, Calvin McCaskill.
Mm.
So Stephen died in 1954, but of course he left a strong legacy of very talented descendants behind. You see his granddaughter, Sissy Houston here. You see two of his great granddaughters, Dionne Warwick and Whitney Houston, and his great great granddaughter, the late Bobby Christina Brown. So that's just a little bit of this very important American story, going all the way from homesteaders to international superstars, and it's a beautiful connection. So I'm glad to share that with you all.
And thank you for sharing this beautiful history. It kind of explained a lot about you being a recording artist, but we'll talk about that later on. I want to hear Margot's stories because all of your stories have me like, okay, I want to know more. Hi, Margot. So it's your
Hi,
turn. What you going to share with us?
thank you so much. And as everyone has said, this is such a great opportunity, and I'm so thrilled to be here. So let's see
Okay.
if we can get, came right up. All right. So my family comes from, this is my um, paternal side. But it is my father's mother, so it is his maternal side. And this is from Suwannee County, Florida. And yes, they do have alligators there. And Suwannee County, as you see here, it's the orange piece here, and it's up in the northern part. It's about halfway between Jacksonville and Tallahassee. It's one county south of the Georgia border, and it is in an area that is known as the Wiregrass. Suwannee County is also known for the Florida Folk Music Festival that is held there every Memorial Day weekend, I believe it is, and for the Stephen Foster State Park.
Wow.
I'm sorry?
No, it's very nice. The images are nice.
Thank you so much. So the top image is my grandmother, Leela, and the bottom image is of her parents, Randall Farnell and Sally Jacobs Farnell. Randall is therefore my great grandfather and the homesteader, and he was born in Hawkinsville, Georgia, enslaved. Although it is interesting, I can find nothing about him as an enslaved person, but I have been able to document his mother as an enslaved person for much of her life, and then for reasons I don't know, I just have no information on his enslavement. And then his wife Sally is actually from Alabama, but they are first found in the 1870 census in neighboring Columbia County, Florida, where I'm pretty sure Randall was living at the end of the Civil War, and his mother was still there. And it appears that she died somewhere in the mid-1870s, at which point they moved to Suwannee County because that's where Sally's parents were living. And in 1876, my grandmother, Leela, was born. She was the youngest of their children. And the following year, Randall applied for his homestead land. So you see here his application here on the left, and then eventually the patent that he receives several years later. Now, one of his witnesses, no, before I get to that, let me say that he was able to perfect it in 1885, and it appears he had no real problems. As other people have mentioned, it is sometimes difficult, and the office was in Tallahassee that he had to go to, and I remember driving it and thinking from Live Oak to Tallahassee, and today it's about an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes on a highway. Then I'm sure it was not that easy back in the 1870s. And so that was a difficult trip, and you had to bring your witnesses with you in order to prove your claim. You had to bring witnesses that say, that testify that you have indeed cleared your land, lived on your land, farmed your land, and have never left the land, have never abandoned that land, that you continuously lived there. And so you and your witnesses have to make this arduous trip. So it is not it is not a simple trip, and that is proved in this next story, where one of Randall's witnesses was Henry McGee, and Henry had gotten sick during his claim. Now Henry's claim started in 1863, I believe, 1862, and he got sick along the way, and his wife got sick, and he wasn't able to go to Tallahassee. And so if you see on the left, they canceled his claim. My great-grandfather, Randall, and the clerk of the court, he was friendly with the clerk of the court, they got together, and the clerk said it was okay. He would allow Henry to give his testimony right there in Live Oak, which is the county seat of Florida, and the main area that they lived in, that he would allow him to give his testimony there, and he would forward that testimony to the office in Tallahassee. But in order to do that, there were about 30 or 40 people in town, men, because women don't count, of course, in that time period, men who signed this petition here. This is the front page of the petition, but they signed the petition on his behalf to say, please, please reopen this claim and let him have this claim. And among the signers of that claim were Sally's father, Randall's wife, Sally, her father, and her brother, Joseph. And that's important because years later, Henry's daughter, Addie, married Joseph. So they all became family. And Henry's land was right next to my great-grandfather Randall's land. And so you get to see it here, and you see the little green man, that's Randall. And unfortunately, his head cuts off where you would note Henry's land, because it was just to the north of Randall's land. But in addition to that, I've been able to research two additional people who did not make it into the book. Shadrach Taylor, whose land is over here, as well as Ned Wilson, whose land is also right here. And like Falan, I have been able to discover that there are 41 other African American claimants in the in Suwannee County. So that's just in the county. And this is really interesting because these federal records, do not mention people by race. So I assume that people haven't known that there were all these African American claimants because they didn't see them marked as such in the records. So you have to cross-reference them with the census and other records. So I think that's quite significant. But meantime, across town, now the Farnells and McGees lived on the northeast side of Live Oak, and on the southwest side were my Williams family. And this is my great grandmother, Ellen Wilkinson Williams. And they were from South Carolina originally. And her stepfather, Alexander Gaynor, who married her mother, Frances, and this is their marriage certificate over here, he also filed a claim for homestead land. And what was interesting about his claim, when I went through the paperwork, you see, this is a final statement for him, and there's a little a stamp that sealed it. And but what was interesting for me was that his witness, Israel, and yes, it's spelled E-A-L, not the way we would spell the country. Israel's two daughters, Rebecca and Center, were co-students with my grandmother Leela at Florida Normal, which became Florida A&M in Tallahassee. And they signed her autograph book, my grandmother's autograph book, which was also signed by the founding president of Florida A&M, Thomas DeSales Tucker, and also other students and teachers. And that book was trotted out all my life and waved in front of me to tell me that I would be going to college, and there was no other discussion about that. One of the other witnesses for Alexander was also the Reverend Robert Allen, and he was the minister that actually married Alex and Frances. So there are all these interlacing relationships, friends supporting each other, neighbors supporting each other, and all coming together to help each other acquire their land. And here is his final statement and final patent. And as I mentioned, I had found these two others that were actually friends of Randall's, because at one point Randall and Ned Wilson were actually living in the house together. And Shadrach, which was another sad story because he died in the middle of his application. And at another point, it also was canceled, and his wife went and said, please, no, this is wrong. Please open it again for me. And they, after some back and forth, she was able to get it opened again. And lo and behold, she died. And eventually they found cousins from Valdosta, Georgia, who came down and were able to finally perfect the claim and make and acquire the property for the family. Oddly enough, I'm not sure what happened. I tried to research what happened with the cousins and so forth, and I've not been able to get clear information on that. But I did find that interesting. And those two stories are also on the National Park website, the Homestead National Park website under Black Homesteaders. All of these stories are there, as well as the 3 stories in the book. And thank you.
Wow, what fascinating story and such beautiful images. I want to start with each of you, going back to Fallon. What inspired you to become a genealogist and research your family history?
Thank you for the question. I love this question. So I started, as mentioned in my presentation, as a youth. I went to a family reunion in middle school, and I received a book with a list of the research that my cousins had done, my older cousins. And they only went to the generation of their generation and my grandparents. So it didn't include my mother. It didn't include me. I took a little personal offense to it. And I wanted to pick up where they forgot, or maybe, it was harder for them to collect that data. And when I picked up an interest for it, I was so fortunate that they welcomed me and they showed me how they were able to retrieve documents. And back then, of course, there was no online, there was no, ancestry.com. But they helped me understand how they retrieved documents and from local sites. And then after that, I decided to continue on my own. And it wasn't until my later former years where I started doing it professionally and wanting to help others. So it turned from a selfish kind of interest, like, don't
Mhm.
forget me, like, how did you forget our entire generation, into someone helped me understand how to do genealogy, and now I want to help others. And that was my story into getting involved in genealogy. And I'd like to tell everybody, no matter if you're a beginner or you're a seasoned genealogist, there's always something to learn. I didn't start doing searching for Black homesteaders until 2 years ago when I met Bernice. And I have learned and opened so many doors in my research that were once closed. So
I'm
thank
so
you
happy.
again so much.
I'm so happy that you and and your family was left out, because that turned into a very positive thing, because
Yes.
now look at what you have done, because if you would have saw yourself, maybe it wouldn't be where it is today. So I'm kind of happy that it was.
Me too. That's a great way to look at it.
All right, Forrest, what inspired you?
Yes, thank you for asking. I love that question as well, and I love talking about this. I was always interested in my family, but never knew anything about it. I didn't know anything past my grandmother, who I knew, who I loved, with one of my dearest best friends. Spent a lot of time with her, but she would not tell me about her parents for some reason, as much as I would ask. But I really, really focused on it. And it's directly tied to my presentation today. But when Whitney Houston passed away in 2012, that's the first time that I found out that her family and my family were from the same place. I didn't know that growing up. So when I read that, I was like, huh. And I knew it was, rural areas that, everybody's related. So
Mhm,
I said, well,
mhm.
I know I got to be related to Whitney Houston. And I set out to figure out how I'm related to her. And for about 5, 6, 7 years, I found absolutely nothing. But on my grandmother's side, however, on my grandfather's side, who was the original Orice Smith, I found out so much information about his incredible family. Um, so that kept me going for the few years that I wasn't finding anything on my grandmother's side, and that coincided with a lot of family deaths. So I was getting a lot of obituaries and things, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know these people were related to these people, and so I put it all together. And one day, my grandmother finally opened up to me about her side of the family, and I was able to do that side as well. And now on that side, I've gotten back into the 1700s and found some really incredible slavery era records, and it's been truly rewarding to get back on that side. But it all started with Whitney.
What a gift. What a gift. I mean, it's so much to explore right there. And I want to come back to you with another question, but I want to hear from Margot what inspired her to really get into the family research.
Well, I think like Doris, I have been interested since I was a small child. And about when I was 7 years old, my father's sister, who was the oldest member of the family that I knew at the time,
Mm-hmm.
um, and she knew some of these people, and she knew, and obviously she knew her parents, but she also knew my great grandmother, the picture that I showed, Ellen. And she wrote the entire Williams and Farnell family history down for me, complete with biblical begats.
Oh, really?
And it was fun.
Yeah.
um, and so over the years, I would press her for questions and more questions and more questions. But I still Aunt
Okay.
Moody was still alive. I sure, because as I learned things, it's always the questions that you didn't know to ask, right? And
Yeah.
so as I learned things, I wish, and I learned things that I think maybe even she didn't know answers,
Uh-huh.
didn't know, and I wish she was alive so that I could share them with her. But she was truly my inspiration, and I always say she is the person that is responsible for me being interested in family history.
And thank you for pointing that out, Margot, because a lot of times, we think about the questions we wish that we would have asked,
Hmm.
or we would have had these conversations with someone, especially when people who we know had a connection to the previous generation passed on. We
Hmm.
all find ourselves saying, I only wish that I would have talked to them and got more information. So thank you for pointing that out, because I hope that most of the listeners that's listening tonight will understand. We think we have time, but look at it like this. We don't ever know. So if there's something you want to ask, something that you want to talk about, do not put it off, because all five of us here can tell you, big mistake, big mistake. I want to go back to Fallon, because I see that there's an agriculture connection. And looking at your family with agriculture, did you know that prior to choosing the profession that you chose?
No, and I always tell people I'm so embarrassed. That was my tagline. I'm the first generation in agriculture. My family is originally, from, at least as far as we knew,
Hmm.
they were mostly Gulf Coast based. So Louisiana, New Orleans, Thibodaux, Mobile, and then Apalachicola. I call it the Bay. We traveled the bays. And I would say we were fishermen, oystermen, but I would not say we were in agriculture. I would go on job interviews, I'd get positions, and I'd be the first in my family. So,
I thought
when,
you was, huh?
yes, and when I even told
Hmm.
my current position, I told them, I said, all these years I've been telling people I was the first, and I was not. But I was so happy to learn that our family had roots in agriculture, and it was a chosen roots. So after he was emancipated, he chose to continue, and he chose to homestead land, and he chose to grow those crops. And that was something I was very proud to find out. And I presented, I worked for the USDA. I presented at the USDA. I've
Mm.
shared my research with my teammates.
As
It's
you should,
Yes,
as you
it's
should.
something I'm very proud of.
Yes, well, thank you,
And
because
thank you.
I like to garden, and every time I'm in my garden, it's like my ancestors are walking with me, because they too was in agriculture. And I remember growing up, I used to hear a lot of people, they were sort of ashamed to be the descendants of farmers. But what they didn't know is that most of the farmers owned their land. They had no idea how much land they owned. But today, in 2023, they are changing that, because now they really realize just how free their family was, because they was landowners. They was able to feed themselves. Most of them had a pond on the land, and they had timber, which in turn helped to build the house. So they were self sufficient with little to no education. So yes, I am happy to hear you say that, time back into the homesteaders. And I want to go to Horace, because he found out this connection with Whitney Houston, but he's a recording artist. Did you know? Did you know there was any connection with this musician? This music and the talent, these musicians, that was new to you as well?
That was totally new to
Oh,
me.
my
I
goodness.
couldn't have I never would have guessed that. I'm thinking, I'm from Hartford, Connecticut, born and raised, and Whitney is from Newark, New Jersey, born and raised. And a lot of us that came up north, that's all we know is where we were born up north. We don't know
Mhm.
where our family came from before that. But I had always been a musical historian. I always liked to look into where people got their talent from, where they were from, and so I was reading about Whitney when she passed, and it talked a lot about her mother's family, the Drinkard family, because they could all sing. They all can sing. Her mother, the mother's sisters, the cousins, everybody can sing. And then it said that the Drinkard family owned a substantial amount of farmland in Blakely, Georgia. And I
Mhm.
was like, Blakely, Georgia? That's where my grandmother was born. And this town is about, it's this big. It's a beautiful town. I love going down there. And Blakely, Georgia is right on the southwestern corner of Georgia. So it's Early County, which is on the Alabama border, and it's also about an hour from Florida. So my family migrated between Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. And Georgia being one of the 13 colonies, not a homestead state, but both Alabama and Florida are. So I have family that are from Georgia, but were able to take part in that by moving to Alabama or Florida. And it's really been wild to find that out because it was total shock to me.
The connections is there. And it's because of research that is revealed. We think that we'll be doing something new, like Fallon said, but we're not doing anything new. We are really walking in the steps of our ancestors, and research just help us to really connect the dots. Margot, coming over to you, you had some of the most beautiful photographs, and looking at the
Thank
images
you.
and looking at you, I can see the beauty that was just passed down from one generation to the other.
Thank you.
How did you come about having these beautiful photographs in your possessions?
Aunt Moody. Aunt Moody had quite a collection of family photos, and she passed them to me.
What a gift.
Yes, and some years ago, because I knew that um, I was not going to be having grandchildren, so um, I decided that I would actually gift them to the Black Archives at Florida A&M, since my
That's pretty.
grandmother had been an early student there.
Good for you. Good for you. Between Fallon had found 150 other homesteaders, and
Right.
Margot, you found 40. Is
Yeah.
there a book in the future between, the stories that you both have come about?
Entirely possible. I we haven't really sat down and said, okay, let's do it at this moment, but it's something we have bandied about. Yes.
And I think that we all can
And
just
Bernice is over there been going, do it, do it, do it, do it.
yeah, I can see that. I can see her championing and being a cheerleader do it. But it's just great, and it's amazing to see that our ancestors owned land, and we can't thank Bernice enough for pioneering and really, when I think about what she did, it's
Mhm.
basically equal to our ancestors, tilling the land, cutting down the trees, removing the stumps out the ground and working the ground to get it workable for planting. That's exactly what she did with, bringing forth. Look, our ancestors did own land, and Margot pointed out that it was an hour and some minutes drive on with a car, so you can only imagine what that hour was like with transportation, a mule or walking.
Right. Um, and one of the other things I wanted to comment, just a few days ago, I saw a clip from a speech by Martin Luther King where he was talking about how he was, and I double checked with her, referencing the Homestead Act and how it helped poor white farmers.
Mhm.
And he was saying, well, we got nothing. And I'm like, no, Martin, not exactly. Uh,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I don't want to minimize that many of us did indeed have nothing. But I also want to note that there were, as we see, a number of us who, even if it, we weren't able to hold on to it forever, we were out there on land, acquiring land, doing what we could to try to be self-sufficient and
Mhm.
and to create futures and generational wealth for our children. We were there doing it, um, and thanks to Bernice, we can now, hold
We
that
now
up.
know. We now know.
Yes,
Now know there's documentation. We know
yes,
where to,
yes,
where to find those records, where to look, and what should we be looking for in those documents. I
right.
have two last questions that I would like each of you to answer before we turn it over to Bernice. Is any of the land still in your families today?
No, mine is not.
Okay. Anyone else?
My Florida family's land is not, well, some of it is. I have lots of homestead homestead ancestors and homestead cousins. So some of them, yes. Especially in Alabama though, where I have Alabama homesteaders, I have a lot of folks there that still have their land. And I can think of one of my Florida cousins who still has homestead land from the 1870s. But there's lots of others that don't.
Mhm. Margot, is any?
Um, no, this land was then sold in the late 1890s because
Mhm.
they moved up and moved into town and became city residents.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty sure that the land that they sold helped them buy the property that they then bought
Yeah.
in the city of Live Oak.
Mhm.
That property stayed in our family until the 1960s.
Now
So
I saw that was very nice, Fallon, what you did with the bell. That was really nice to put the dirt in there. That was really, really nice. And what I really enjoy looking at is that you included a lot of the young people in that. So that was, I can only imagine some of the conversations that you all was having around the table. So I'm glad to hear that you walk the land and you do have some of the Saul where they walked on the land, so you're close to your ancestors. Did
Yeah.
anybody else walk the land where their ancestors walked and owned? Anyone else?
I went down there and I drove. I didn't exactly get out and walk because some of it is not owned by
Mm-hmm.
family, or it might be private property. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm northern and I'm from the city, and I don't want to be stepping on anyone's toes in
Yes. Yeah.
rural
Yeah.
Florida or rural Alabama. But I did
At
go down
least you
there.
drove by. You drove
Yeah.
by.
I drove by and I had to feel the presence of, where my
Mm-hmm.
ancestors stood. Even going to the courthouse, because I was going there to look for land records. That's why I went down there. So I was
Mm-hmm.
in the courthouse and I'm like, they probably, or not probably, I know they went to this courthouse. That's what's on the land entry papers, is that they
Yeah.
went to the courthouse to, submit their papers. So I definitely had to feel those experiences close to the land.
Right. Right. What about you, Margot?
Um, no, I didn't know the exact coordinates,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say, at the time I actually went to Live Oak. This predates this endeavor with Bernice. I knew that we had homestead land, but I did not think to um, pull those papers out of my many boxes and look up the exact coordinates and then go find the exact piece of land. I did find the home in the city, the location of the home in the city. It is gone because the city came through and changed the road, so they took the
Yeah.
house. But
Yeah.
I can stand in the intersection where the house once stood. So, and I had a cousin who went with me, who knew Live Oak and went with me, um, met me there and showed me around Live Oak and so forth. So in that sense, I did feel like I had been there, and I was to the cemetery where all my um, Florida family members are buried, other than those who came north. And so yes, and it's always a surreal moment to stand on in the spot that your ancestors
Yeah.
were.
Yeah. Real time. Real time. So I just want to thank each of you. It's an honor, it's a pleasure just to meet each of you. Bernice have told me so much about each of you, and I just want to thank you once again for honoring your ancestors, for telling their stories, because it would not be told if it wasn't for each of you. Your discoveries are just wonderful. Thank you for sharing it. Nurturing Our Roots would like to extend an open invitation to each of you to come back if you just want to share your stories and just keep telling it everywhere you go. There's a song they used to sing in church. I'm going to tell it everywhere I go. Well, that's what I want you to do. Continue telling your ancestors' story everywhere you go. This little light of mine, you let it shine. You tell it, you let it shine, and you tell it everywhere you go. Because with doing that, you are showing this generation, if our ancestors could have done it, without all the resources that we have that's available to us, and with the money that we make annually, and they didn't see that in a lifetime, and they broke barriers. They accomplished many things. And with that, they had us in mind. And so, if they had us in mind, we must keep them in mind. And the way that we do that is honor their legacy, keep adding on, and keep telling their story. Because each of you stand on the shoulders of some strong, mighty people. And I can feel their energy just coming from each one of you. So thank you for being a guest here on Nurturing Our Roots. And I do want to turn it to this wonderful woman, Bernice. Thank you, Bernice, because if it had not been for you, we would not be hearing these stories that we're hearing from these three guests today.
Well, I am so proud to I sat here with this big smile on my face as I listened to Margo, Falan, and Orice talk about their Florida homesteaders. And just to think that in the book, The Black Homesteaders of the South, if you could see it, Margo's grandmother is on the cover of this book.
What?
Yes, yes. And if you go in the book, you actually see Margo's documents. She put those documents in this book. And I said, okay, she wants them in there. We're going to get those documents in the book. But the fact that people took a chance and said, well, let me look. Let me see if what she's talking about could have an impact on me. Would it make a difference if I looked and I found my ancestor? And then they got the actual papers from the National Archives. And that's the point I want everybody to understand. Those papers are at the National Archives. I mean, can you imagine? And they've been there. Been there. But now you see these descendants sharing their stories.
Because there's federal records, so that's why they are in the National Archives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something to understand. And so this book has 49 stories of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida,
Louisiana,
Mississippi, and Louisiana. So we have stories from the South. That's why it's called The Black Homesteaders from the South. And I'm hoping that we will just continue to hear people like Falan and Margo and Orice share their stories to inspire others to take that step and look, to go to the Bureau of Land Management and put in their ancestors' name and find that they indeed own land. And then take it to the next level by getting those records. I mean, that's what we're doing. And I'm hoping, I want to see a book to come out from all of them.
Yes. That's a lot of stories. I mean, 140, 150 with Fallon and Margo 40. That's a book. That's book.
Several books. That's several books. Just Florida, really. And I know Orice and Dr. Mary Clark, they've been looking in Coffee County, Alabama. Wonderful. And so there are other stories there, not to mention the stories from Mississippi, but we have 30 homesteads, 30 public land states in this United States. And we need to know if others are all out there and they haven't told their stories yet.
Wonderful. Well, before closing, Bernice, would you please talk about the awards that the book have won from the next generation of indie books?
Yes, just recently, the book received an award from the Next Generation Indie Awards, 2 Silver Medal Finalist Awards, and also from the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. We received the Phyllis Wheatley Award. And the book right now is up for 2 other awards, and we're just waiting to see what's going to happen. But this is our award. I celebrate the homestead descendants every time they write a story. I just say, just be prepared. I'm going to blast it on Facebook. Everybody's going to know that you wrote this story and we celebrate. And that's what we should be doing, celebrating.
That's right. Well, I just want to thank each of you for being a guest here tonight. It has been very informative. I've learned a lot about your ancestors. I feel like when I go back and read that part of the book now, I feel like I can put a face to the story and I know something of the story. But as we do our own genealogy research, it's so many self discoveries. And thank you for sharing yourself the stories with us, like the stories say, nurturing our roots is our story, our history, and our legacy. And I want to thank each of you for joining me right here on Nurturing Our Roots. And remember, we want you to come back. All right. Good night, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.